Lecture 9. And then, turning a story into a plot.
In this first of 6 lectures about plot, I want to take as scripture something that my freshman English teacher at Big Rapids High School told me before I was 14 years old. Even at that age, I already knew that I wanted to be a writer, and my English teacher, Mrs. Nancy Giltner, saw at least enough promise in me to offer me the following insight and to trust that I would understand it. Literature, Mrs. Giltner said, is the creation of order out of chaos. It is the creation of meaning and structure out of a reality that is otherwise meaningless and without structure. Another way to put this insight is to say that real life does not happen in stories. It's true that our lives have beginnings, middles, and ends. But unlike a story, where the writer chooses which events are important and arranges them in a meaningful way, real life happens in a seamless, irresistible flow that does not break itself into discrete, well-rounded scenes. We do not speak in carefully crafted sentences. Our lives don't necessarily have clear conflicts. And our lives do not necessarily resolve neatly, the way lives resolve in stories. We are carried from the birth canal to the grave in a relentless stream of experience surrounded by countless other people who are experiencing the same thing. While some of our experiences are more important than others, it's only because we choose to impose meaning upon them, often, in fact, by telling stories. Stories, in other words, are not natural. They are created in an arbitrary process through which the writer picks and chooses from a nearly infinite set of possibilities and makes something orderly and significant out of it. Stories are often what make our lives meaningful, bearable, and even joyful. But we impose stories on real life, not the other way around. At this point in these lectures, this should not be news to you. We've already looked at several ways that fiction imposes order on chaos. When we evoke a scene or a situation, we pick and choose the details that best get across what we want the reader to see and understand. When we create character, we pretend to get inside the heads of other people, and we pick and choose traits to make a lifelike individual out of a handful of details. And when we write dialogue, we suggest real speech without actually reproducing it. We impose purpose on speech that, in real life, can be messy, halting, and digressive. But perhaps the most important way fiction imposes order on chaos is through the creation of stories and plots. Often people will look at a real-life situation and say something like, "Boy, that would make a great novel." Writers get this all the time. Sometimes, after I've told a friend of mine something that happened to me in real life, that friend will say to me, "Well, there's your next book." Stories are so prevalent in human cultures and in our own personal lives that it's easy to think that they occur naturally in the world. We sometimes think that stories are like fruit hanging from a tree, and that all a writer has to do is pluck them. But it's more complicated than that. Taking what Mrs. Giltner told me as scripture, it becomes axiomatic that all fiction has a structure. Even for narrative works that don't have plots, all fiction can be broken down into a few fundamental components. Specifically, all stories have a situation or a context, at least one character, a conflict of some sort, and a resolution to that conflict. All these elements are inextricably linked in every work of fiction, and if you're missing one of them, it won't work. The initial situation needs to be dramatically productive. In other words, the initial situation needs to produce a conflict. Furthermore, the character or characters need to have some sort of relationship to that situation. The conflict can be external to the characters, or it can be an internal conflict within a character. And the resolution must resolve that conflict in some believable and dramatically satisfying way, though not necessarily happily or pleasantly. Sometimes, in fact, the resolution of the conflict is that it doesn't get resolved. We'll look at that paradox in a later lecture, when I talk about narratives that don't use an ordinary plot. And let me add just one more thing. All fiction must possess a quality that the writer and teacher John Gardner called profluence. He defined profluence as the feeling you have when you're reading a novel or short story that you're getting someplace. Another way to think of this quality is simply to call it forward momentum. Whether you're writing a highly plotted, complicated story like Game of Thrones or Harry Potter, or a modernist plotless masterpiece like Mrs. Dalloway or Thomas Pynchon's epic novel Gravity's Rainbow, you need to give the reader a reason to keep turning the pages. Profluence doesn't necessarily mean that a story has a plot per se. In a conventional narrative, you read to find out what happens next, but there are other reasons to keep reading. Sometimes, as in a plotless story like Anton Chekhov's story, The Kiss, you read to gain a deeper understanding of the central character, even if that character, as in The Kiss, never comes to understand himself. Or you might read just to inhabit a strange and richly detailed world, or to enjoy their author's writing style. For example, plot is secondary in Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast trilogy of fantasy novels, but they are still tremendous fun to read. The profluence in those books comes from their evocative detail, their wonderfully strange characters, and the author's gorgeous prose. We're going to talk about non-traditional structures in a later lecture, but in this lecture and the next two lectures, I'm going to talk about the old-fashioned traditional plot, which is still, by far, the most common structure for fiction. I think it's safe to say that our culture is dominated by the traditional plot, and not just in prose fiction. If you've ever, as I have, devoted an entire weekend to devouring all the episodes of a single season of The Wire, Battlestar Galactica, or Breaking Bad, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. All three of these shows are superb feats of long-form storytelling, and they offer many other riches besides simply a gripping plot. But on a first viewing, they turn the question, what happens next, into something as addictive as Walter White's blue meth. And yet, some fiction writers remain uneasy with the idea of plot. In his book, The Art of Fiction, John Gardner called plotting the hardest job a writer has. And from among the writers of my own acquaintance, I've heard that plotting is the part of the job that usually gives them the most anxiety. Some writers even think of plot as slightly disreputable. All the elements of fiction are fundamentally arbitrary impositions of order on the formless chaos of reality, and yet plotting is somehow seen as even more arbitrary than the rest. Probably no one has expressed this uneasiness as productively as our old friend E.M. Forster in Aspects of the Novel. At the beginning of his second chapter, he imagines three types of reader and asks the question, what does a novel do? The first reader seems a bit puzzled, as if he'd never considered this before, and he says, well, a novel tells a story, I suppose. The next reader, who's a bit of a blowhard, says, why, a novel tells a story, of course, and I've got no use for it if it doesn't. The third reader is Forster himself, who says, in a sort of drooping, regretful voice, yes, oh dear, yes, the novel tells a story. He then says that he wishes this were not so, and he calls storytelling a low atavistic form. He then goes on to compare a story to a tapeworm, calling it a series of simple, linked segments laid out in chronological order. A story, he says, can only have one merit, that of making the audience want to know what happens next. And conversely, it can only have one fault, that of making the audience not want to know what happens next. I'll confess that I sometimes share this ambivalence. You may recall that in my first lecture about character, I defended talking about character before anything else by making the argument that you can write about characters without a plot, but you can't create a plot without characters. I even said that all fiction is character-driven, but that some fiction is more character-driven than others. Well, I'm not taking any of that back, but I want to take what Forster said about the one merit and the one fault of storytelling, and I want to apply it to all fiction, not just storytelling. Here's my version. A work of fiction can only have one merit, that of making the reader want to keep reading. And it can only have one fault, that of making the reader not want to keep reading. Note that my version takes Gardner's idea of profluence into account. In other words, we may want to keep reading for other reasons than plot, and not just to find out what happens next. In fact, there are all sorts of ways of generating profluence that don't necessarily put storytelling up front. In a later lecture, I'll talk about other ways to structure fiction and to give it forward momentum in order to keep that hypothetical reader turning the pages. But right now, I want to make the case that creating a good, engrossing, and yes, entertaining plot is one of the most satisfying things a writer can do. And I also want to make the case that creating a plot is no more arbitrary than creating characters. Think back to the story I concocted in my very first lecture about Sarah and Brad, the couple at the baseball game whose marriage was on the rocks. You could take the same series of events and tell it from several different points of view, from Sarah's, from Brad's, from a mutual friend's, even from the godlike, omniscient point of view of a narrator. You could also play with the order of events in all sorts of ways. You could tell the story strictly chronologically, starting from Sarah and Brad's first meeting and ending with their divorce. Or you could start from the moment where Sarah tells Brad she's unhappy and then show their previous relationship in flashback. Or you could even tell the whole story backwards, the way Julia Alvarez tells the story of a Dominican-American family in her novel How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents, or the way Harold Pinter tells the story of an adulterous love affair in his play Betrayal. Done well, each version of Sarah and Brad's story could be equally satisfying and meaningful, yet each would be very different from all the others. Each starts with the same series of events, but depending on how you order those events and whose point of view you tell them from, the same situation could amount to a completely different story in each version. Plotting is an incredibly powerful tool, but like any powerful tool, it's difficult to handle. If you don't take enough control over it, your plot will seem loose and formless with no forward momentum. You'll end up with a series of events that have no particular importance or obvious meaning, too much like real life, in other words. But if you use narrative too forcefully, you could end up with something melodramatic, mechanical, contrived, and unbelievable. We've all read books where the characters appear to be little more than puppets of the author. Even if the characters are fully rounded, they are often required to do unbelievable things in order for a plot to come out a certain way. So, how do we avoid contrivance? How do we create stories out of formless events and create an order that seems both satisfying and lifelike? Let's return to E.M. Forster again. He clarified this problem by making a distinction between stories and plots. In a very famous passage in Aspects of the Novel, he defines a story as simply a series of events linked by their chronology, but he defines a plot as a series of events linked by cause and effect. Here's Forster in his own words. The king died, and then the queen died is a story. The king died, and then the queen died of grief is a plot. The time sequence is preserved, but the sense of causality overshadows it. Or again, the queen died, no one knew why, until it was discovered that it was through grief at the death of the king. This is a plot with a mystery in it, a form capable of high development. It suspends the time sequence. It moves as far away from the story as its limitations will allow. If it is in a story, we say, and then? If it is in a plot, we ask, why? Just like Forster's distinction between flat and round characters, this is one of the most famous tropes in creative writing. And like a lot of famous pronouncements, it's easy to oversimplify it. I still love placing things on a continuum, so perhaps it might help if we think of stories and plots being at the opposite ends of the same continuum, with the most basic chronological story at one end of the continuum and the most subtle plot at the other. Let's look at some examples. Often the most addictive stories are the ones that simply answer the question, as Forster puts it, and then? These are the stories we like best as children, the ones we beg our parents to read over and over again. On a first reading, children can't stand not knowing how the story turns out, but they insist on repeat readings because they take comfort in revisiting the same steps the story took in getting to the end. And children often insist on hearing the story told in exactly the same way, and they become frustrated and disappointed if you vary the details even slightly. This reinforces the idea that with a good story, it's not just the destination, it's the journey. And as we get older, that desire to learn the answer to "and then" never really leaves us. When you're gobbling down episodes of Breaking Bad and neglecting the rest of your life, you're watching the story in the same way you used to lose yourself in a book as a child. Much of the pleasure we derive from even a mediocre Hollywood blockbuster comes from watching the story unfold one plot point at a time. And we still derive that pleasure even if the story is predictable, as many blockbusters are. Take one of my favorite action pictures, for example, Die Hard, in which a tough New York City cop named John McClane takes on a bunch of terrorists in a Los Angeles skyscraper. Even watching that film for the very first time back in 1988, I pretty much knew how it was going to end. Spoiler alert, the terrorists lose. But the predictability of the plot didn't diminish my pleasure in watching the story twist and turn step by step to reach the inevitable triumph of Bruce Willis. And knowing exactly how it ends hasn't diminished my pleasure in watching it at least a half dozen times since. Because it's a clever story with vivid, if not especially complicated characters. The film works as an unusually seductive sequence of and thens, with each sequence being a little more over the top than the last. Closer to the middle of the continuum, between story at one end and plot at the other, are such blockbuster literary series as the Harry Potter books by J.K. Rowling, or the epic fantasy series A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin, better known in its HBO version as Game of Thrones. The overarching story of each of these series of novels moves relentlessly forward chronologically. The Harry Potter books start with Harry Potter being chosen to attend the wizard's school at Hogwarts, and they end years later with an epic battle at the school between good and evil. A Song of Ice and Fire starts just before the start of an all-out war between several aristocratic houses, which will determine who is going to be the ruler of Martin's imaginary medieval world of Westeros. Each of these series are tremendous feats of old-fashioned storytelling. Just ask any of the countless readers who have stood in line at a bookstore on publication day and then raced home to do nothing for the next 24 hours but read the latest installment. But these narratives are more complicated than Die Hard. Whereas Die Hard moves forward chronologically with no flashbacks and only a few references in dialogue to previous events, most of the narrative momentum of Harry Potter involves Harry figuring out what happened between his parents and the villain Voldemort before he was born. We get this information in flashbacks, stories from other characters, mysterious documents, and magic visions. Rowling very skillfully mixes up the chronology of the backstory and gives us all sorts of information out of order, even as the main story moves unstoppably forward. Each of these non-chronological editions moves the Harry Potter books away from Forster's simple chronological tapeworm, what will happen to Harry next, and towards Forster's idea of a plot. Why is Harry so important? It's a plot, in other words, and not just a story. The construction of A Song of Ice and Fire is even more complicated. For one thing, the fictional world of Westeros has a long, convoluted history that precedes the events of the first book. And that previous history largely determines the existing relationships of the various aristocratic houses and the individual characters in them. For another thing, Martin's use of point of view is more complex than Rowling's. Whereas the Harry Potter books take place almost entirely from the point of view of Harry himself, A Song of Ice and Fire is told from the points of view of many characters, varying chapter by chapter. This also makes the chronology of A Song of Ice and Fire more complex. Especially in the later books, the same period of time is told from several different points of view, which means that the plot occasionally loops back on itself. And even though the books have a tremendous forward momentum, much of the pleasure in reading them comes from elements other than the plot. These other elements include the rich evocation of a fantasy world and access to the thoughts of some really interesting characters. In the end, of course, we want to know who wins the struggle for Westeros, and we want to know who lives and who dies. But along the way, there is much to savor that has little to do with simply answering the question, and then? Now, moving to the literary end of the story plot continuum, let's consider a book I talked about in my lectures about character, Joseph Conrad's great novel, Lord Jim. This book has one of the most complex plots in modern literature. Yet the basic events of the story are pretty simple. Bear with me as I go into a bit of detail. In the late 19th century, a romantic young Englishman, whom we know only as Jim, seeks his fortune as a sailor in the seas of South and Southeast Asia. Even before his career as a sailor has properly gotten started, he becomes the first mate of a rusting old freighter carrying Muslim pilgrims across the Indian Ocean to Mecca. When the freighter, called the Patna, collides with some unseen object in the water and threatens to sink, the rest of the crew prepares to abandon the ship, leaving the pilgrims to die. Jim considers himself superior to the other members of the crew, but at the last minute, he jumps into the lifeboat along with them. With this impulsive act, he instantly betrays his own sense of honor and shatters his naive conception of himself as heroic. After Jim and the rest of the crew are rescued and arrive in port, however, they learn that the Patna didn't sink after all. The rest of the crew disappear, but Jim deliberately turns himself in to the authorities in order to accept responsibility for what happened. At a tribunal of sea captains, he is stripped of his seaman's license, and his career and his reputation are ruined. After that, he drifts from job to job across Southeast Asia. Finally, he accepts a dangerous job far upriver on a remote island, and he helps a village defeat an oppressive warlord and win its freedom. By the end of the story, it looks as though Jim has found peace and redemption at last. But in a final series of incidents which I won't give away, his past returns to destroy him. Told this way, chronologically, this sounds like a pretty straightforward story. It's an action-packed one at that, featuring storms at sea, dramatic courtroom encounters, and battles in the jungle. And it is exciting. I read it for the first time at the age of 10, after seeing the movie version starring Peter O'Toole, and as a child, I read it strictly as an adventure story. What I didn't recognize at that age, however, was how complex the plotting was. And I couldn't understand how the complexity of that plotting made it into something richer and more melancholy than a mere adventure story. Bear with me again for a few moments as I compare the chronological version, Forster's idea of story, with the way Conrad actually tells it, Forster's idea of plot. As you may recall from my lecture on character, Lord Jim opens with a description of Jim marching straight off the page at the reader. As it happens, that moment actually comes about halfway through the chronological version of the story, several years after Jim's disgrace at the trial, but before he goes upriver into the jungle. After that introduction, Conrad then jumps back to Jim's upbringing in Britain, then works forward chronologically to the moment when the Patna runs over something in the water. At that point, without saying what happens to the ship, Conrad jumps to Jim in the witness box at the trial a month later. Up till now, the novel has been narrated in the third person, but now the story is picked up by a first-person narrator named Marlowe. This narrator is talking to some acquaintances on a hotel veranda long after the trial, but before the final events of the book. Marlowe tells them about attending the trial. Then he jumps back a few weeks to tell how he witnessed the arrival in port of the rescued crew of the Patna before it was discovered that the Patna hadn't actually sunk. Marlowe then returns to the trial with a long digression about one of the members of the tribunal, Captain Brierly, who commits suicide not long after the verdict. Then Marlowe tells of meeting of Jim in the street shortly after the verdict and of inviting him to dinner at his hotel. At this point, over the course of the next several chapters, Jim tells Marlowe what really happened that fateful night on the Patna. And that is only the first quarter of the book. The rest of the book is equally complex. I want you to note that not only does Conrad jumble the chronology, he also tells the story through several layers of point of view. There's the unnamed third-person narrator who starts the book. Then within that narration, there is Marlowe speaking in the first person within quotation marks. And within Marlowe's first-person account, there's Jim's account of what happened on the Patna, which is told in the third person by Marlowe with occasional snatches of Jim's actual words in the first person. Got all that? We're a long way from Die Hard here. In fact, we're even a long way from Game of Thrones. If you tell Lord Jim chronologically, it's a fairly straightforward tale about a young man who makes a bad mistake and then tries to redeem himself. But told the way Conrad does, through various narrators, with the story starting in the middle and looping backwards and forwards, it becomes an intimate and intense psychological study of a character who was not redeemed by his idealistic conception of honor, but in the end, destroyed by it. Now, think back to what Forster said about the difference between a story and a plot. A story answers the question, "and then?" and a plot answers the question, "why?" A simple story like Die Hard has a binary resolution. Does Bruce Willis defeat the terrorists or doesn't he? Harry Potter is a bit more complicated because we learn a lot of backstory along the way. Also, the world of Harry Potter is more complex than the world of Die Hard. But in the end, the story comes down to another binary resolution. Does Harry Potter defeat Voldemort or doesn't he? Game of Thrones is more complicated still, with more points of view, a more complex imaginary world, and a much darker view of human nature. Book by book, there are winners and losers, but the author complicates things by sometimes letting the people we hate win and letting the people we love lose and even die on occasion. Game of Thrones is a richer experience because it answers both questions. Readers rip through the books to find out what happens next, but what makes reading them so satisfying is that each volume also answers the question, why are these things happening? Each of the leading characters becomes more complex and rounded as the plot progresses. Characters we thought were old-fashioned heroes begin to show weakness, bad judgment, and even cruelty, while characters we hated from the start turn out to show flashes of tenderness and compassion. Conrad's plot in Lord Jim is the most complex of all these examples, and yet, oddly enough, it may be the most realistic of all of them. Chronological narratives seem lifelike because we seem to experience our lives in chronological order without knowing what's going to happen next. But while Conrad's method may not mimic the way Jim's life happens, it does mimic, in a very lifelike way, the manner in which most of us learn about the other people in our lives. Think about someone you've met as an adult and have gotten to know really well, your spouse perhaps, or a good friend, and then think about how you learned about them. Chances are that person didn't sit down with you on your first meeting and tell you his or her whole life story in chronological order from birth. Rather, you got a vivid first impression, and then over days or weeks or years, the rest of that person's life was revealed to you in bits and pieces and out of chronological order. This is how the plot in Lord Jim works, and it results in a much more intense and intimate experience of the character. The reader is given the basic information about Jim's life and then expected to assemble it in chronological order without any help from Jim, or for that matter, the author. Some readers, of course, won't want to put in the effort, and that's fine. But for those of us who do, we come to know the character of Jim as intimately as we would one of our best friends. The conclusion of Lord Jim is very powerful. Even though I've read it at least as many times as I've seen Die Hard, it never fails to shake me up. The final effect is not just, "Oh, so that's how it turned out," or "take that, Voldemort," but a profound understanding of how a person's best qualities can sometimes lead to his ruin. Before I wrap this lecture up, I want to make clear that I'm not saying that simple storytelling is inferior and that complex, non-chronological modernist plotting is superior. One of my other favorite books, and one of the greatest novels ever written, is George Eliot's massive Victorian novel, Middlemarch. This book has a wonderful, complex plot with many strands, but it moves forward just as chronologically as Die Hard or Game of Thrones, only with a lot fewer explosions and beheadings. And I really, really love Die Hard. It's just that narratives like Die Hard's and narratives like Lord Jim's reach different regions of a reader's heart and brain, and they serve different functions for the writer. Now here's an exercise to help you explore the difference between a story and a plot. List all the major plot points of a story you admire or a story of your own, but write them out on index cards, one plot point to a card, in the order in which they actually appear in the story. If it's a narrative which is told out of chronological order, try putting the cards in chronological order and see how it changes the effect of the narrative. If it's a narrative that already moves chronologically, lay the cards out and see what happens if you start rearranging them. And if you want to be especially bold, just shuffle the cards and try retelling the story in whatever order they end up in. Deciding how to arrange the events of a narrative helps to determine what you want the reader to take away from it. In the next lecture, I'll explain the famous Freytag pyramid by using The Wizard of Oz as an example. And in the subsequent lectures about plot, I'll look at different types and techniques of plotting and give you some suggestions for making choices about just what kind of story you want to tell.